I like to believe that majority of the people who've played all the way through Red Dead Redemption 2 got the honourable ending. And maybe I'm being a little hopeful in saying that, as a lot of people who play this game seem to have a clear passion for making sure that the crocodiles by Saint Denis don't go without food, but the honourable ending, at least in my opinion, makes the most sense in terms of Arthur's progression as a character and the whole theme of redemption that the game is based on. Now I know that some of you watching played through the game and made your Arthur do some horrible things, which is understandable considering how many opportunities this game gives you to be a heartless monster, but I'd say that the vast majority of people, at least on the first playthrough, aim to make their Arthur as good a person as possible, especially in the later stages of the game. And assuming that you didn't go and kill 250,000 innocent people and then tried to redeem yourself just by greeting a couple of people on the street, if you got the honourable ending, chances are your Arthur died a reasonably good man. Not a perfect man, but all things considered, a good man nonetheless. But I was thinking, what if we took it to the next level? What if we made Arthur Morgan such a good person that all those around him immediately accepted him as some sort of holy savior? What if, with just a little bit of extra effort, we guided Arthur to the end of the game using the most honourable path possible? Helping Arthur ascend to that level is not going to be an easy task, especially not when we consider the two golden guidelines of this playthrough. Just two very important golden guidelines that we need to follow as closely as possible in order to accomplish that goal. So, golden guideline number 1. Arthur himself is to kill no one unless it is absolutely necessary to progress the game. However, allowing his peers to do the dirty work for him is 100% okay. And golden guideline number 2, if I have to stop somebody from breathing in order to progress the game, I must first try to give them a donk on the noggin before outright killing them with a weapon. So much like Bruce Wayne and his confusing moral code, if it's necessary, I can crush somebody's skull with my fist, resulting in a traumatic brain injury and potential loss of basic motor skills, but any use of guns is strictly prohibited. Now, just as a general note, the goal here is to finish the game with as few kills to humans with guns and as few knockouts with my fist as possible, but keep in mind that achieving absolutely 0, as far as I'm aware, is impossible. I will try absolutely every potential way that I can possibly think of to get through each area without murder or knockout, but sometimes it just might not be possible. Now, I also came to realize that knocking someone out with your fists can also result in a death, but ensuring that the enemy doesn't die from the hit isn't something that you can control 100% of the time, so any enemy taken down with melee will be added to the knockout tally, regardless of if they die of a brain aneurysm upon hitting the ground. With all of that out of the way though, let's get started. Our journey as Western Jesus begins in a fierce and unforgiving snowstorm. A group of outlaws on the run with no choice but to press through the unforgiving weather to find some shelter. The gang trudges through the cold and eventually stumbles across a little shack where Miss Grimshaw mocks up some homemade clout goggles for Davy and Dutch gives an inspiring speech about global warming. Dutch and Arthur then head back out into the storm to look for food and the rest of their people when they stumble across everyone's favourite magician, Micah Bell. Known for his famous trick that involves making his beer belly disappear with a single button-up shirt. He said he spotted a shack not too far from them with plenty of noise and plenty of people, and so the three of them decide to go and investigate. They pull up to the homestead, hitch their horses, and both Micah and Arthur decide to hide while Dutch goes in to talk to the owners of the house alone. While Dutch attempts to convince the men into giving them some food or some shelter, Micah discovers a corpse in the wagon he's hiding behind, suggesting that the men occupying the house aren't exactly the friendliest of people. Now this is where my goal to keep Arthur as pure as possible hits its very first obstacle. The moment Micah finds the dead body, we're given our very first objective, which is to protect Dutch. Now of course, the game wants us to protect Dutch by ruthlessly murdering everyone in sight, but as per our golden guidelines, we want the least amount of violence possible here. Before I even started recording for this playthrough, my plan for this very first mission was just to lasso as many enemies as I could, restrain them so that they couldn't shoot back, and then leave them in the open for Dutch and Micah to shoot. However, as you can see right now on screen, I pull up the weapon wheel and stare at it in absolute disbelief as I realize that the lasso is actually not yet available. So in a matter of minutes, any sense of a plan I had for the beginning of the game was swiftly drop-kicked out of existence. So I devised a plan B on the spot, which consisted of me sitting behind cover and doing absolutely nothing, leaving the two seasoned outlaws, Dutch Vanderland and Micah Bell, to kill the enemies themselves. Now, I'm not exactly sure if it's because it's the first mission of the game or because I have a brain the size of a blueberry, but for one reason or another, I actually expected this to work. I actually believed that sitting back, relaxing, and watching as Dutch and Micah reduce every one of the enemies to a Swiss cheese-shaped stain on the snow was actually going to work. I mean, they're scripted to take out at least one of the enemies in the beginning, so surely they have the capability to take out the rest, right? I mean, honestly, my hope lasted for a while as the shootout continued, but I was hit with the realization that maybe this mission wouldn't be quite as effortless as what I'd originally thought when Dutch took his very first tumble. I looked on as the game called me a failure for a little bit and then decided on my next plan of action right away. Now, when you couple a blueberry-sized brain with the fact that I haven't played Red Dead 2 in quite a while, you get a plan that looks exactly like this. Yep, that's me desperately retreating to my horse, attempting to find a lasso on there. Now, I still had my heart set on getting through this area with 0 kills and 0 knockouts. We were only on the first 2 attempts after all, so I decided to resort back to my original plan, but this time, move into different positions in hopes of drawing fire away from Dutch and Micah so they could return shots without so much attention. And I thought it was working at first, as the enemies seemed a little confused on who to shoot at, but ultimately, the numbers the enemies had on us proved a little too much once again. After a couple more attempts at the same strategy, I'd mostly accepted that Dutch and Micah wouldn't have the chance to kill all of the enemies themselves, with so many of them shooting back. So as I moved into my next attempt, with no real clear plan, I decided to just start experimenting. I pulled out my gun and started aiming at this guy's lantern, contemplating whether it was morally acceptable for Arthur to set him on fire in this playthrough, but quickly decided against it when I remembered our no gun kills unless 100% necessary rule. So instead, I decided to just start shooting in the general direction of the enemies to see if it would give Micah and Dutch any more chance at taking them out than before. It didn't, and honestly, I was already at a little bit of a loss at this point. It seemed to me that Dutch and Micah simply couldn't kill all of the enemies with so many of them returning fire, so for my next attempt, I tried to utilize a real life strategy that often helps with my problems when they all become a little too difficult. When running away from my problems inevitably failed, I decided that unfortunately, a completely non-contact approach to this mission probably wouldn't work. However, that did not mean I had to go around causing severe concussions or running up that knockout tally just yet, as I remembered that Red Dead 2 has a disarming feature that allows you to knock the weapons out of the enemy's hands when close enough. With my hopes suddenly replenished and my optimism higher than Skinny P and an unsupervised 24/7 chemist, I went ahead and disarmed both remaining enemies, being careful not to approach them too quickly, as the same input while sprinting causes Arthur to tackle the enemy instead of disarming them. With both enemies disarmed, I began leading them into Dutch and Micah's line of fire, while they desperately tried to knock my teeth out for parting them with their revolvers. As I ran them around in circles, waiting for Dutch and Micah to finish them off as the enemy was no longer a threat to them, I realized that Dutch had completely given up. He remained stuck to his cover, back to wall, guns in hand, fingers on triggers, but he just refused to do anything. The enemy was now completely open to fire with absolutely no way to shoot back, and yet he just stood there having a full-blown existential crisis on the battlefield. You have an arrest, mate. So at this point, I'd already lost faith in Dutch before he'd even insisted to everybody that we believe in him. But to my surprise, Michael was still at it, peeking up from his wagon every so often to shoot at the unarmed enemies I had tailing me. And I never thought I'd say this in all of my life, but I felt as though Michael was my saving grace here. He was our way out of this. I believed in him. And so I watched as he tried his best at defeating the revolverless enemies. They continued to tank his bullets for quite a while, but I just assumed that because it was an AI that was causing them damage, it would naturally take a little longer for them to kill than what it would for the player. I led the enemies his way, putting full trust in him to take out the two of them, only to be reminded why we don't trust people who eventually turn out to be the human reincarnation of Stuart Little. I watched as the once again unarmed enemy slipped past the very armed Micah and delivered the coldest bitch slap I'd ever seen.
He needs some milk!
A bitch slap so ferocious, so devastating, that Micah's only response was to sit down, shut up, and contemplate his life choices while I was left no other option but to sprint around in circles wondering what to do next. And I came to find out later that this is not the last time we'd be let down by Micah Bell. I ran over to the horses we had tied up to the post in the beginning of the mission in hopes of maybe being able to ride one into Micah, knocking him off his cover, and maybe forcing him into rejoining the fight. But, as it turns out, the option to actually mount the horses is disabled during this mission, so it was back to running away from my unarmed pursuers while dodging punches and than dealing with Arthur's periodic asthma attacks. And I'll be completely honest, already, at this point, I really didn't have a clue what to do next. I thought for sure that once the enemies lost the capability to shoot back, Micah and Dutch would be able to get rid of them relatively easy. But as I ran aimlessly into the snow, trying to maybe lead the men far enough away that they'd get sick of me, I began to accept that maybe these enemies just weren't scripted to be killed by anyone other than the player. So I decided to finally let the two guys kill me, my hat made a last-ditch escape attempt, and before I knew it, I was back to square one. Still determined to clear this area without any kills or knockouts, I decided I'd try to make a break for the enemy horses that are scripted to run away in the beginning of the shootout, as I thought that maybe knocking Micah off his cover to re-engage him in combat was still worth a shot. It wasn't. I missed the horses completely on the first attempt and watched as they disappeared into the mountains, but to match the disappointment of that attempt, I caught one of them the second time, only to realize that these ones couldn't be mounted either. By this point, I'd finally realized that it was time to accept a difficult truth. I wasn't getting through this area without breaking at least somebody's nose. I was not getting through this area without adding at least a couple of digits to that knockout tally. But of course, I was still determined to keep that number as low as possible. So at first, I tried tracking each knockout to make sure it hadn't resulted in a death by aiming my gun at every unconscious enemy in hopes that I'd see a red dot to signify they were still breathing. But eventually, unfortunately, I realized just how inconsistent this was. One minute I could hammer some of the shack's loose nails in with an enemy's head and have him be completely fine. And then the next I couldn't even give someone a kick in the shin without them swiftly passing away in front of me, so eventually I decided any enemy taken down with melee would be added to the knockout tally, regardless of the inconsistent red dot. Now that I finally had a somewhat proper plan in place, I decided to get to work, knocking out any enemies that Micah and Dutch weren't scripted to kill, while trying not to be shot to pieces in the first place. Unfortunately, I got shot to pieces a lot of times. As I made my way around the shack, dodging as many bullets as I could before moving in to knock the enemies out, I discovered that the greatest enemy of all was actually not the men attempting to murder me, but rather Arthur's inability to attack an enemy while moving without performing a full-blown crash tackle. See, this crash tackle left me much too open to shots by the other enemies for it to be utilized here, so approaching the enemy slowly before attacking was essential. Of course, this in itself is risky because slowly approaching someone hell-bent on putting you 6 feet under often results in them doing just that. A couple of sickeningly brutal knockouts later and I was finally onto the next segment of the mission, which is basically just a repeat, a couple of additional enemies who come spilling out of the house to kill you. Dutch and Micah actually managed to pick up another 2 kills, and I continued to be careful not to knock out anyone that I was sure Micah and Dutch could handle themselves, because again, I want as few knockouts here as possible. I tried to make sure to give enough time to determine whether or not an enemy couldn't be dealt with otherwise before moving in for the knockout, but after the last enemy of the bunch went down after tanking quite a lot of shots, I got paranoid that I hadn't given enough time for each enemy to get killed during this attempt and decided to restart just to be absolutely sure. So let's pause for a moment to be clear. The previous attempt's results stood at 3 knockouts from me and 4 kills from Dutch and Micah. The best possible ratio you could get that I was aware of after all of my attempts so far. Now for this attempt, again, giving Micah and Dutch even more time to kill the enemies just in case, I obviously needed a ratio either the same or better than the last one to continue. And by the time the last enemy of the bunch popped out of hiding, I was sitting at 3 knockouts from me and 3 kills from Dutch and Micah, which meant that this final enemy could consistently be avoided by me, meaning that the perfect ratio for this area was indeed 3 knockouts by me and 4 kills from the boys. Unfortunately, what isn't so consistent is, of course, Micah's loyalty, because for some completely unknown reason that I still cannot figure out, right when he's needed most, Micah decides it's time for him to leave. That's it. He gets up from his wagon, runs over to his horse, and leaves the shootout before I can even properly comprehend what's going on. Did he forget to turn the oven off before leaving home? Did he decide that a life of theft and murder was no longer the life for him? I don't know. Maybe he decided to go and star in another Stuart Little movie, but the bottom line is, his sudden disappearance destroyed this attempt, and for some reason, after a certain point, Dutch just becomes completely useless. He decides that his guns are purely a cosmetic accessory and won't do anything but stand there like a mannequin modeling the newest winter fashion in the clothing aisle of Kmart. So what I'm trying to say is, we need Micah here to progress. Without him, I'm forced into knocking out an extra enemy, tipping the perfect ratio of 3 knockouts by me and 4 kills by them into an unacceptable 4 knockouts by me and 3 kills by them. Thankfully, after so many attempts, I had a pretty exact route that I knew I could take to keep the enemies in the right spot for Dutch and Micah to kill, while also being able to get around to all of my knockouts without being in a constant line of fire. So to perfect the final attempt, I hid behind some wood and waited for Micah to get spooked by the dead man in the wagon, parkoured out of cover, slapped this man in the face, got knocked on my ass, put him to sleep in retaliation, went for a jog around the shack, gave this dude a hug, gave this dude a severe spinal injury, waited for Dutch to take care of his enemies, hid behind the cover while Micah shot this dude in the back, allowed the enemy running away to flee successfully, and just like that, we finally completed the bulk of this mission with the seemingly perfect ratio of 3 knockouts by me and 4 kills from Dutch and Micah. Obviously, not the ideal scenario I had in my head of me not having to harm any enemy at all when I was first going into this, but still the best possible result to progress the game that I could find after all of my attempts. And although this wasn't the end of the mission, the hard part was definitely over. All there was to really do next was to raid the cupboards of the shack for any valuables, food, medicine, Club Penguin card, Jitsu cards, the absolute essentials, anything of real value to the rest of the gang. Next step, of course, is to check out this barn, and I did get a little worried I would have to add to the knockout tally since you have to fight the man who drops from the sky here, but I was happy to remember that you can choose to let him go after the fight instead of knocking him out. Now, the O'Driscoll must have me mistaken for somebody else here because I most definitely did not shoot his cousin, as we all just saw, but regardless of his horribly inaccurate accusation, I decided to let him go to preserve Arthur's innocence. I picked up my gun, picked up my hat, I bonded with the spooked horse inside the stable who told me his name was Frank, really cool guy actually, and after a long chat about our favourite movies and what makes them so good, we decided to leave the stable and finally end the mission. After hearing screams from inside the house, we rush in to find Micah got into an argument with some woman after she rejected his request for her Epic Games username, but Dutch liked her enthusiasm so much that he invited her back to come play professional Fortnite for the gang's esports team, which, was pretty cool of him to do considering her fucking house was on fire. And yeah, just like that, Arthur, Dutch, Micah, and new gang members Frank and Sadie make their way back to the camp, which concludes this mission and concludes our very first episode of this High Honor playthrough. We weren't able to clear this mission without any use of violence at all, but we were able to clear it with a measly 3 knockouts, which to my knowledge is the absolute minimum we could have progressed with.